Honestly, the biggest mistake people make is thinking Malcolm X was just naturally born angry at the world. You have to realize that the intense fire you saw in his speeches wasn't raw, unfiltered emotion spilling out by accident. He treated that anger like a highly refined product, something manufactured with precision to serve a much larger strategic goal. It's fascinating because he realized very early on that calm logic rarely makes the evening news or grabs people's attention. His public persona was a calculated performance, designed to shock white America and awaken black America simultaneously. Think of his outrage as a deliberate marketing tool, a necessary megaphone used to cut through the noise of complacency. He was essentially acting as the chief marketing officer for a revolution that hadn't fully started yet, you know. He controlled the temperature of the room perfectly, raising the heat when he needed action and lowering it when he needed them to think. It wasn't about losing his temper. It was about using temper as a weapon against a system that thrived on silence. And you have to wonder, how much energy did it take to maintain that mask of perpetual fury every single day? To understand his mind, you must accept that prison wasn't just a punishment for the man then known as Detroit Red. For Malcolm, those years locked away became an intense, self-imposed educational incubator that totally rewired his brain. He didn't just do time. He systematically converted dead, empty hours into valuable intellectual capital that he would use later. He copied the entire dictionary page by page, which is just an incredible feat of discipline when you think about it. This wasn't about getting a degree. It was about acquiring the raw tools of logic, language, and forensic debate. He transformed that tiny, cold cell into a personal university, devouring books with a hunger that most free men never experience. He was building a cognitive armor that would later make him invincible in debates against people with far more formal education. By the time he walked out of those gates, the street hustler was dead, replaced by a highly disciplined intellectual machine. It's a powerful reminder that your environment doesn't have to dictate your growth if you have enough mental fortitude. But what would have happened to that brilliant mind if he had never been forced into that solitary confinement? The transition from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X was way more than just a simple religious conversion or a new nickname. You have to see it as a complete, top-to-bottom corporate rebranding of a human soul, executed with flawless precision. He understood that his old identity was a damaged product, associated with crime, ignorance, and being a victim of the system. By adopting the X, he was violently rejecting the name given by slave masters and demanding a total reset of his history. This new identity allowed him to enter a completely new market, appealing to people looking for strength rather than assimilation. He was essentially saying that the man you knew before doesn't exist anymore, so you have to deal with this new entity. It takes an unbelievable amount of courage to kill off who you used to be and build a stranger from scratch. This rebranding gave him a clean slate, a protective shield against anyone who tried to drag him back to his past life. It's a lesson in personal crisis management. If you don't like the story your life is telling, burn the book and write a new one. But did that heavy, symbolic X ever feel like a burden that trapped him just as much as the name Little did? Malcolm X understood, way before the internet age, that whoever controls the narrative ultimately owns the audience's reality. He was incredibly ahead of his time in how he manipulated media, understood sound bites, and utilized the power of shock value. He knew exactly how to drop a verbal bomb that was so provocative the newspapers had no choice but to print it on the front page. It wasn't just what he said, but the specific rhythm and cadence of his delivery that mesmerized both his friends and his enemies. He realized that if you don't define yourself loudly and clearly in the public square, your enemies will gladly do it for you. He treated the mainstream media like a hostile takeover target, constantly outmaneuvering them at their own game of perception. You could argue this was an early form of media control, a precursor to how modern influencers manage their personal brands today. He never let an interviewer back him into a corner. He always flipped the script and put the system itself on trial. He forced America to look in the mirror, and he knew exactly which angles would make the reflection most uncomfortable. But in fighting so hard to control his public image, did he ever feel like he was losing touch with the private man underneath? Many people mistakenly view his divisive rhetoric as pure hatred, but it was actually a highly sophisticated strategic simplification. In the complex marketplace of ideas, Malcolm knew that clarity and simplicity will always beat nuance and complicated theories. By creating a stark, us versus them, binary, he offered an immediate sense of belonging and identity to people who felt invisible. He wasn't just preaching, he was organizing the chaotic frustrations of a community into a single, coherent, and powerful direction. This is classic crisis marketing strategy. Define the enemy clearly, and your base will mobilize with much greater speed and intensity. He understood that you cannot build a strong internal community without first defining strong external boundaries against a common threat. It felt extreme, but sometimes you have to shout the simplest message just to get people to start listening. He forced people to pick a side, eliminating the comfortable middle ground where apathy and inaction usually thrive. This tactic wasn't about permanent separation, but about consolidation of power before entering any negotiation with the establishment. But was this extreme simplification ultimately a trap that made it harder for him to evolve when his own thinking changed later? His eventual break from the Nation of Islam wasn't just a religious disagreement. It was the highest-risk business decision of his life. You have to understand, to leave the organization that made him was a non-negotiable renegotiation of his entire contract with reality. It wasn't betrayal in his eyes. It was a necessary maturation because the organization could no longer contain his expanding worldview. He was walking away from his income, his security detail, his social status, and his spiritual family all in one single day. Imagine the psychological toll of realizing the father figure you revered, Elijah Muhammad, was actually flawed and corrupt. This was the moment he truly became an independent CEO of his own destiny, answering to no board of directors but his conscience. He knew the price of this independence would likely be his life, yet he signed the termination papers anyway. It proves that true leadership sometimes requires burning down the very structures that helped you build your initial success. He chose the terrifying uncertainty of truth over the comfortable security of a lie, which is something very few people can do. When he walked out that door alone, did he feel liberated, or did he feel the crushing weight of total isolation? His pilgrimages to Mecca and travels across Africa were the crucial pivot point that transformed him from a local leader into a global idea. Seeing Muslims of all colors, including blonde-haired, blue-eyed men, completely shattered the racial dogmas he had preached for over a decade. Honestly, it was like the CEO realized his product was flawed and decided to immediately expand into international markets to fix it. He stopped seeing the struggle as just an American civil rights issue and began reframing it as a global human rights crisis. This shift was terrifying to the American establishment because a global coalition is much harder to suppress than a domestic minority. He was broadening his market base, seeking alliances with African heads of state instead of just arguing with local politicians. This wasn't him softening his stance. It was him sophisticatedly upgrading his ideological software to a much more powerful version. He returned to America not with less fire, but with a much clearer, more accurate targeting system for his outrage. It showed his incredible capacity for growth, proving he was never a rigid dogmatist but a constantly learning student of reality. If he had been given more time to cultivate these new global alliances, how different would the world look today? The final year of his life was perhaps the most dangerous phase because he entered a state of profound ideological loneliness. He was no longer following Elijah Muhammad, and the mainstream civil rights movement still didn't fully trust him. This is the terrifying solitude that any true thinker eventually faces when they outgrow all the available boxes and labels. He was a man without a country, spiritually speaking, trying to build a new organization, the OAAU, completely from scratch while under constant threat. You have to appreciate the sheer mental fortitude required to wake up every day knowing you are politically homeless. His old allies called him a traitor, and his old enemies still considered him a dangerous radical, leaving him nowhere to rest. This loneliness, however, gave him a clarity that is impossible to achieve when you are just echoing the sentiments of a crowd. He was navigating uncharted territory, drawing a map for a future that only he could see clearly in his mind. It was the silence before the final storm, a period of intense introspection where his final philosophy was being crystallized. In those final lonely months, did he find peace in his truth, or was the silence deafening? It is naive to think they killed Malcolm X simply because he was angry or sounded violent in his early speeches. The truth is much scarier. He wasn't assassinated for who he was assassinated for who he was fast becoming. To the establishment, a static extremist is manageable, but an evolving, pragmatic revolutionary with global connections is an existential threat. He was killed at the precise moment. His message was becoming universal enough to unite different groups against the power structure. The timing wasn't accidental. It was a strategic removal of a volatile asset that could no longer be predicted or contained. They didn't fear his past. They feared the future he was actively constructing through his new alliances and broadened mindset. His death was less about punishment for past deeds and more about preemptive damage control for future potential. It's the ultimate tragedy of a CEO who is fired permanently, just as he is about to launch his most innovative product. The bullets stopped his heart, but they couldn't stop the momentum of the consciousness shift he had already initiated. When he stepped onto that stage at the Audubon Ballroom, did he know in his gut that his transformation was finally complete? Malcolm X didn't just die young. He died with an unfinished mind, which is the greatest tragedy of all. We are left with the blueprint of a magnificent structure that was only halfway built when the architect was taken out. He wasn't a fixed point in history. He was a trajectory, a soaring arrow that was shot down mid-flight. To only study the by any means necessary phase is to completely miss the beautiful complexity of his final evolution. He proved that a human mind, even one forged in the fires of trauma and prison, has an infinite capacity for change. His legacy isn't just about fighting racism. It's a testament to the power of disciplined self-education and intellectual courage. He remains the ultimate example of someone who refused to let society define his limitation or his destiny. We shouldn't just mourn his death. We should study his methodology of growth and apply it to our own unfinished lives. The most haunting question isn't who killed him, but where his incredible mind would have taken us next. If Malcolm X had lived just 10 more years, would we even recognize the world we live in today? If this deep dive into Malcolm's strategic mind resonated with you, please subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next analysis of history's greatest thinkers. Honestly, the best way to support this kind of in-depth content is to hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs their perspective shifted. Let's keep this conversation going in the comments below. Tell me, what do you think was Malcolm X's single most important strategic decision?